Hello and welcome to My Emotional Armor, the podcast where we discuss the effects of covert narcissistic parenting. I am your host, Cindy Koo, a survivor and robot warrior here to share the ways emotional armor can help you heal, stay safe, and regain your sense of self. I am back, my lovely robot family. I took a little break to work on my spiritual practice, which included taking a few classes on being an empath and highly sensitive person. I have an inkling that many of you may be as well. If that is the case, let me know in the comments if you'd like to see an episode on it. So after learning so much about covert narcissism and finally getting to a place where I was feeling validated, this really opened up an area of transition for me. I felt more healed and like I could learn about myself in a new light. It's been the first time for me that I started to delve into spirituality. Before, it was almost too big of an undertaking because in a lot of ways, I was just trying to survive with my covert narcissistic parent, which I'm sure many of you are able to relate to. So once I got physical, mental, and emotional distance from my CNP, I had the space in my life to up-level, so to speak. I felt more confident and authentic in my direction because I wasn't carrying them around in my back pocket anymore. And the places this has led me over the last few months has been really joyful and eye-opening, as well as still a work in progress. I feel like it never quite ends, but there's little steps up here and there. It's from this space that I'm happy to return to you all with a fresher perspective and ways to move forward. I also want to thank those of you that reached out. I thought of you often and knew I'd be back to connect with our community, and now feels like the right time. So I want to talk today about blame and some of the big revelations I've had surrounding it in the context of my covert narcissistic parent. Over the course of the last few years, I noticed myself getting irritated, angry, and set off at over small things. It could be how much I owed in taxes. I'd curse the government and send myself in a tizzy over it. If someone cut me off while driving, I'd go on and on about that person and how people are generally awful. I noticed that I was getting very blamey. Not to mention it was raising my heart rate and stressing me out unnecessarily. As I started to learn about the common traits of CNPs, I saw that these types of narcissists are super blamey themselves. As you know, they are always the victim. Everything happens to them. I made the automatic connection that I learned this anger and victim mentality from my parent. And that's why it was showing up in my adult life. It was a pretty straightforward connection. Once I noticed that, I worked to dismantle it through therapy, reframing, and grounding, which were all great and helpful, especially in those moments where I was getting worked up. But recently, I made another connection that helped me on a larger, more macro level. And that was the realization that even before I learned from my CNP to blame others, I learned to blame myself. And who was the first to blame me? My CNP. I am certain that at some point you've been labeled by your parent as the cause of their pain, their suffering, and why their life hasn't worked out the way they wanted it to. You're probably not the only reason. CNPs usually have a laundry list of who and what has wronged them that they repeat to you over and over again. But at various points in your childhood and probably into your adulthood, the finger was pointed at you. You were blamed. You, a child, were blamed. For myself, I was told by my CNP that my mom left when I was a year old because she, quote, didn't want to be a mother. I can see how my parent arrived at that logic. Since my mom left shortly after my birth, he concluded it was because of me. And he was also in a lot of emotional pain, so he was A, not thinking clearly, and B, because he is a CNP, he is wired to look to something else, a baby even, before he will ever look at himself. Now, it's not going to be hard for you to come up with a time your CNP blamed you as a child, teen, and well into adulthood. It is their bread and butter. It is their supply. But the interesting thing I realized is that the repeated blame from my parent eventually grew into me taking responsibility for things outside of my control. Because my parent blamed me, I learned to blame myself. Let me give you an example. As a child, I remember my parent asking where I wanted to grab dinner, and I would say Yoshinoya. If we went to Yoshinoya and the parking lot was full, my parent would flip out, and I, a 5 or 6-year-old, would feel responsible for the parking lot being full. I would criticize myself in my head and in my child brain for not picking, Burger King instead. And in this situation, it's not like my parent blamed me overtly. He was genuinely upset over the parking situation. But I took it on because I learned early on it's my fault. And I also learned, which many of us CNP children do, I'm responsible for my parents' happiness. This is a lot for a child. This was a lot for you. Fast forward and you find yourself doing this at work, with friends, and in relationships. You probably obsess and find fault within yourself for things you had zero control over. Let's say your partner is having a bad day. You'll think back at all the events prior and remember, we stayed up talking that one night. I shouldn't have brought up my problems. When no, your adult partner is 100% capable of saying, wow, I'd really love to focus on, what you're telling me, but I'm fading. Can we talk tomorrow when you have my undivided attention? They have the responsibility and agency to do that. Is it your job to manage your partner's sleep schedule? No, it is not. And yet you've made it your responsibility because as a child, you were made responsible for all of your parents' bad days. So then what happens is you normalize this self-blame and over-responsibility in your mind. It becomes the way you think and the way you assume other people think. But the truth is, most people are just worried about themselves, and rightfully so to an extent. You can only control what you do, and others will act and react accordingly. You can't make anyone do anything. So in this way, it is better for all of us to focus on managing our own actions and thoughts versus managing others. It's a little like this saying I hear in support group, which is stay in your own lane. That's basically that in a nutshell. Now, you grew up a little differently in that your parent directly related what you did and didn't do to their state of well-being. So you were taught the opposite of stay in your own lane and instead learn to be hyper aware of your covert narcissistic parent so as not to set them off. And they are pretty volatile. So you could unknowingly trip a poor me cycle or a rage fest from them. You didn't get the luxury of a carefree childhood in that sense. You may not even know what that means. You may be familiar with it only because you saw it in TV or at your friends' houses. Now let me ask you, when is the last time you were not worried about your parent? When they weren't constantly in the back of your mind? I bet you don't even know what that is like. I hate to use the word normal, but that ain't normal. And I learned this by talking to other people who grew up believing that their parents were doing just fine. And that's the way it's supposed to go. Parents are supposed to worry about their children, not the other way around. Okay, so going back to adult you. Here you are, blaming yourself and expecting others to tiptoe in the same way that you do. What happens is you are constantly being jilted. At this point, you have more in common with a CNP than you'd like to. This is a lot of times why you find yourself blowing up, spending hours or even days angry at something small like a person who acted rudely in the checkout line. Now, if you're here listening to this, you have a certain level of self-awareness and empathy. That means that number one, you are likely working to change this behavior for yourself and the sake of others. And number two, it's unlikely that you spew this onto others the way your CNP has done to you. Now, like I mentioned in the beginning of this episode, many children of CNPs are empaths or highly sensitive people. And so you're aware of how your energy affects others. So in this way, you're more mindful of how you come off. That being said, the self-blame is still occurring inside of you, even if you control how it manifests on the outside. And just to note, that's the difference with the CNP. They see their internal blame and shame, and it comes out onto you as complaints or stories where they are painted as the hero or martyr. You're probably not doing this because you've experienced firsthand how icky it is. So it's likely showing up in other ways for you, like anxiety, depression, exhaustion, autoimmune disorders, fatigue, and even long COVID, which is something I experienced recently. So what do? How do you work to release the burden of over-responsibility and not blame yourself or others unnecessarily? The relief is, honestly, you don't even have to do that much. If this episode is ringing true to you, you've actually done about 80% of the work, which is simply being aware. The last 20%, I would say, is reframing and then meeting your needs. So what exactly do I mean by reframing? It begins first with recognizing when you're feeling like this is my fault, and instead asking yourself, is this something I can control? So to do this, you've got to be somewhat in touch with your emotions. And if you need help with that, you can search on YouTube on feeling your feelings, and you'll find all sorts of good stuff. I love anything by Lisa Romano, and I will go ahead and put a link down to a specific video below. And chances are, you know deep down the difference between when you are really at fault. Let's say you spill a glass of wine on a friend's carpet versus when you are self-blaming unnecessarily. But if you don't, with this reframing exercise, you'll begin to figure it out pretty quickly with some practice. And then the next thing you want to do is determine what you need. If we take the example I gave earlier with the partner having a bad day, once you've reframed that no, you cannot control your mood, next, ask yourself if you need anything. You may be feeling sensitive to their energy and need to take a walk to center yourself. If that's the case, do it. You don't need to tell your partner why necessarily. Just say, hey, I'm going to go outside for a bit. This type of thinking is really wonderful for getting in touch with your needs, which I notice that children of CNPs have a hard time with because we're used to monitoring our parents' needs. This also works well when you're the one doing the blaming. When you feel yourself getting keyed up and victim-y, pause, reframe, and ask if this is something you can control. Most often, the answer is going to be no. If it's another person, say someone being rude like we used earlier, the answer is definitely no, because remember, we cannot control others. And then ask yourself what you need. Maybe you need to take a few deep breaths, or maybe you need to be done with errands for that day and pick it up tomorrow. I'll give you an example that just happened to me. I went into a meeting at work with my boss and one other colleague. The colleague kept going off agenda, was long-winded, and talking over us. And in general, just also really hard to follow. It was unfortunate because I'm sure she had a lot of good ideas, but because of the delivery, they didn't quite come through effectively. Anyhow, after that meeting was over, I would have wanted to complain about how disorganized she was, in all honesty, but I skipped that because I can't control her communication style or level of what I consider to be organized. So instead, what I did was I told my boss, wow, that was a lot of info. I'm going to take a quick break. And that's what I did. I respected where my colleague was at. She was just showing up at the meeting authentically, however that looked and however my opinion was on it. And then I acknowledged where I was authentically, which was depleted, and gave myself what I needed in that moment, which was a breather. I didn't actually need to complain or bash my colleague in that moment. Now, there may be times where you do need to vent. For those times, I suggest journaling. It's a safe place where you can get that out without unloading on another person or feeling like you're burdening anyone else. Now, I actually love the opportunity when I get to practice this whole process, which is kind of weird because I'm essentially saying I love when people annoy me. But really, it does give me the opportunity to practice tuning into my needs and taking the high road in a way. I feel like it's also a wonderful way to get aligned. As you're doing this work to heal around covert narcissism, you're also learning to be more compassionate and accepting of yourself. And when other people cause interruption, you can encounter them in the same way. You're allowing yourself to feel your feelings, have your needs, meet your needs, and show up just as you are. When you start to bring that out externally, allowing others to exist just as you exist, that is total alignment, and it feels really good. The day that this happened at work, I was oddly thrilled. It felt like a real milestone for me. I finally felt just for a moment free of that hypervigilance that we've all known all too well. It's a freedom that I continue to work at and one that I wish for you as well. So until next time, robot friends, I will see you then. Bye for now. Thank you again for tuning into this episode of My Emotional Armor. If you liked what you heard, please subscribe and leave a review. And if you have any topics you'd like to hear about on the show, please fill out the contact form online at myemotionalarmor.com. I'll see you guys next time, and as always, stay safe and armored up.